Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. This season, we are making our way through the book Climate Obstruction, a Global Survey. I'm getting ready to head to the annual UN Climate Summit, the COP, or Conference of the Parties, in November. And to prep for it, I am reading up on all of the research so far about climate obstruction and how it works around the world. In today's episode, a really important topic, especially for this year's COP, which is how climate obstruction works in the global south and how some of these structures in place continue to privilege global north countries over global south countries when we're talking about climate negotiations, which then makes it that much harder to even talk about climate policy in the global south without it seeming like something that is patently unfair. Joining me to talk about this today are two leading experts on this question. They oversaw a chapter in this book that pulls together all the research that we have so far on it. Ruth McKie from Montfort University and Omar Faruque at Queen's University in Canada. Our conversation is coming up after this quick break. I'm going to ask you a really, really dumb basic question, and that is, please define Global South for us. Let's set the context here.
That basic question is probably a very
a whole book.
Big question. So I think for us setting it out into the context of this chapter, we see the Global South in its geopolitical sense. So it's a group of countries that have a history of colonialism, neo-imperialism, and so that historical context of non-Western nations that now sit within a very different economic and social structure to Western nations that really, it's driven by political and economic marginalization, which then in turn has implications, at least for us in our case, how it then stands with addressing the climate crisis. So we can't see the Global South and Global South countries as this one complete same picture set of countries. Rather, it's a reflection of the geopolitical history in which we've distinguished between Western global north countries and then non-Western countries in the global south. So I think that's the best way that we come to define the global south and how we deploy it in this chapter.
Okay, so you talk about these 5 major considerations when we're looking at climate obstruction in the global south, and I want to talk about all 5 of them, but let's start with what you were just talking about, Ruth, that like these, there's a lot of very different countries in different regions of the world that are in this category of global south. So that means that they have varying commitments, and there are varying commitments even within the countries. Can you talk about those contrasts and how they play out both within the countries and sort of beyond them and between them?
Okay. So I'll pick this up. So here we are referring to the variations in climate commitments among countries in the global south. And we see that these countries, as Ruth mentioned, given the fact that we are looking at these countries from the vantage point of history of colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, and their positions in global political economic order, we see these countries shared experience in terms of disadvantages, in terms of economic growth, development, prosperity, and human development. So a common thing among all these countries is that they are in a disadvantageous situation in terms of economic growth and development. And that shapes their commitment to climate action, their commitment to fulfilling their pledge, their commitment to the Paris Accord. So such disadvantages we see creating these variations in terms of commitment. Take, for example, African countries. We can consider all those countries together in one category. For them, climate action is not a priority. Decarbonizing the economy is not a priority. For them, it's energy poverty, addressing energy poverty, reaching electricity to its population. It's something that is their priority. And certainly they will consider any sort of options to fulfill that goal. So when energy poverty, as a result of their disadvantageous situation in terms of economic growth, prosperity, and human development, is a major concern, then climate action or commitment to climate pledge is something that takes a back seat. We can also think about the case of India. India is a giant economy in current times, but it still considers energy poverty, human development associated with this as its primary concern, because millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in that country do not have access to energy. So energy poverty, energy security, and disadvantageous economic situation is something that is causing varying commitments to climate actions in many countries in the global south.
It's been interesting to see the big oil majors really pick up on specifically energy poverty in Africa as like you would think that they're all just charities trying to solve it. They talk about it all the time.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing here. Carbon majors are expressing interest in many African countries to explore and develop their untapped resources by mentioning this issue of energy poverty, energy security. But there is also another layer of it, and that is the interest of countries in the global north, especially European countries, which are now facing an existential threat coming from cutting off gas from Russia. So they have to find out alternative sources, and they have found with the assistance of their carbon majors some African countries as a source to fill that void.
Yeah. I asked a fossil fuel executive recently if they were planning to invest in grid infrastructure in Mozambique as part of their energy poverty plan, and they were like, "What?"
Because most of these will be exported to Europe.
Of course they will be.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Ghana, for example, it will export all major part of its newly developed fossil gas to Europe. So they are not in a position, like carbon majors are not in a position or not to make any commitment to do anything locally.
So it's often said that, and obviously there's a lot of evidence to this effect as well, that, global south countries contributed the least to climate change, but will face the impacts first and worst. Can you talk about how that plays into climate obstruction?
That's an interesting thing that we observed in our analysis of climate actions and climate delay or obstruction in the global south. The issue of least responsibilities is something that is used most often than not by politicians, political elites, and even civil society groups, environmentalists, noted environmentalists, to sort of justify climate delay, if not climate obstruction. In this case, we are very careful in choosing our words. So, and that is also connected to the notion of climate justice. So it comes from that original 1992 UN FFC climate agreement, where this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities came in. So the global north, they contributed overwhelmingly to historical carbon emissions. So they created this sort of mess or climate crisis. Is now up on their shoulder to take the major responsibility to clean it up, and that is by reducing their emissions, as well as providing technical and financial support to global south countries to first adapt to climate crisis, and then also contributing to sort of mitigation, transitioning towards green energy, all sorts of things. So the notion of least responsibility, historically least responsibility, is something that we find as a kind of justification for delaying climate actions, or even undertaking bold climate actions in many countries in the global south, many big countries. India's name comes to our mind because India is, in recent years, in global UN climate meetings, India is kind of playing the role of a leader of the global south in advocating for them, using the framework of climate justice, climate fairness, all sorts of things. So we find such emphasis on least responsibility is a major factor contributing to sidelining climate actions or delaying climate actions in many countries in the global south. And I will also add one particular point. The notion of least responsibilities is not just that sideline commitment towards greenhouse gas mitigation, reducing their emission. It directs their attention to, most of their time, energy, and attention to building resilience and developing adaptation measures. So their focus on least responsibility takes all energy and resources and attention towards adaptation and resilience. And we also see how that plays out during global climate negotiations. Global South countries call for climate finance contribution equally for mitigation and adaptation and resilience. Currently, global North countries are interested in investing in mitigation, not much in terms of adaptation and resilience. So global South countries invoke this notion of climate justice, least responsibilities, to intervene into that financial arrangements equally divided between mitigation and adaptation.
And I think that goes to the problem that stands in the idea of fair share and differentiated responsibility that comes out under the Paris Agreement, under Article 4. And I think this idea of equity and ensuring justice, it really feeds into the stalemate that then proceeds within conventions, UNFCCC conventions, almost given the example of sort of the Indian negotiations. And it presents that another bigger question around, well, what do these global UNFCCC conventions do? Are they there to push for strong climate action, or are they there to do this slowly or even muddy the waters along this path? And it actually presents a problem for the probably bold action that needs to get taken to address the climate crisis. So I think this idea of fairness established within Article 4 of the Paris Agreements fundamentally is saying, well, it's equity, it's striving for equity, and so they don't start from the place. But I don't think equity really means and connects with justice in and of itself. And I think that's something that underlines what these large UNFCCC conferences do stand for, is equity and increasing equity, but they can't necessarily represent justice. And in this case, climate justice, what we would like to see in terms of climate justice. So I think that might be one of the bigger, I guess, institutional problems of the UNFCCC in their role and how that plays out.
Yeah. Relatedly, I want to have you define and talk a little bit about loss and damage, because I feel like, it gets talked about at every UNFCCC conference and everyone's like, yeah, we should do it. And like, we're going to do it. And then they just don't do it. So yeah, I'm curious what you've found on that and how particularly the persistent failure to actually come through on loss and damage promises has made it easier for global South countries to kind of be like, well, forget it. Then we can't work on this stuff if you guys aren't going to be serious about helping to fund it.
I think, again, it goes to this stalemate and connects with what we've talked about. So this idea of loss and damage. So we mentioned this in the book. It's around the third pillar of global climate governance. So I think it helps shift from even the mitigation adaptation to an actual more formal financial role of providing the finances to cover the harmful impacts, particularly in the global south. And it's based on the unavoidable reality that climate change has and will impact on these countries more so than other countries. And that goes back to the history. Think back to that geopolitical context and the historic colonial history, the neo-imperial history that surrounds these current relations, where loss and damage is there to say, well, we are going to support you and provide you the resources to deal with these impacts. But fundamentally, that means that global North countries are now under, I guess, or seeking financial obligations. And when you've got those financial obligations to contribute to that loss and damage pillar, it's giving it goes back to that contentious geopolitical environment with political interest, financial interest, economic stability. The conversations then go, well, how can we sort of give away so much of this money to support loss and damage for the impacts that the global North, taken responsibility for its actions, to put plainly. But I guess that also comes, and this, I don't necessarily think it comes across in the chapter, but it's also reminds me of a acceptance of responsibility that the global North is failing to achieve, more so than just not wanting to spend money. It then means that there is that responsibility and that ownership that needs to then be accepted. And I still think when it comes to the global North actions, Western Europe, the US, taking responsibility for that history, admitting that that's happened, is what then stalls the negotiations. So we talk about word perfect policy, but an off the cuff comment would be sort of, is that a confession? Do you admit guilt here? And for me, that's the sense that that ongoing stalling, that word perfect policy idea, is the attempt to pause and prevent responsibility then being ironed out into this financial support, which then again creates that stalemate. Well, if they're not going to do it, well, we're not going to do it. And the back and forth continues to happen. So I think loss and damage is that necessary step that needs to be taken, that financial support to deal with those consequences by the global North. But in reality, that does mean accepting more responsibility, for which many countries in the global North fundamentally in there are not willing to do, given the complex social, political, and economic context that each country has in and of themselves. So I think loss and damage is central, but I think at the same time that is stalled because it takes too much to admit responsibility, and thus the consequences that come with that.
Yeah, I'll just add one particular point here. Even though the loss and damage, that third pillar which emerged in recent years within UN COP system, the global North countries, powerful countries, particularly the European Union and the United States, they made sure that there is no such thing there within decision-making process as something that will point towards their legally mandatory obligation or something. So they made sure that such arrangements, loss and damage, will not really bind them towards any sort of legal obligations. So even though that that was removed from this process in the past several years. It is only about financial support. It's not compensation or reparation. Those words are not there. It's simply financial support for global South countries. And we see very little in terms of financial contribution to that fund as of now. Very little.
This has come up already a little bit, the structural issues and geopolitical shifts in climate politics, which are very, very complicated. So can I have you talk about the traditional approach to development and especially, development and growth and how that kind of often gets pitted against climate action?
Yeah, so this is something that we discussed at length, not just in this chapter, but also while preparing a policy brief and eventually this chapter. This traditional approach to development, shaped by the ironclad belief in a new classical economic system, emphasizing growth, development, prosperity, improved human development through market-driven processes, is something that has historically shaped development approaches around the world, not just in the global South, around the world in global North as well. The main focus is that, okay, if we focus on economic growth, market-driven economic growth, it will increase not just economic share of these countries, but also increase competitiveness. And in that process of achieving growth, prosperity, and improved human development, suddenly greenhouse gas emission will shoot up. And the logic is that countries will be able to address high greenhouse gas emissions at some point in their development trajectory by using resources that they accumulated through this path of economic growth and prosperity through their actions in this process. So it's the market-driven approach. We characterize it as traditional approach in the sense, actually the appropriate word would be the mainstream dominant approach to development, focusing on market-driven mechanisms. We call it mainstream or dominant because there are other approaches as well, focusing on sustainability, focusing on its inclusion and other issues which include critique of these traditional approaches. So the idea is that, I'm summarizing this complex phenomenon, the idea is relying on market-driven processes to develop resources to address economic concerns. Along the way, we will contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but we will be able to deal with that at some point in that trajectory by relying on resources accumulated from this process.
And I think it's important to add there as well is that we think about that market-driven approach, that dominant approach, and we don't necessarily touch on this in the chapter, but there's a lot of literature as well as scientific evidence that attributes, and we have to acknowledge the tribute between these market-driven dominant approach, neoclassic economics that have expanded across the world over the past 100 years and have had such negative impacts on the environment with the rise in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's fair to say, I'm not going to say that capitalism is killing the climate. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's certainly a relationship between how the market is structured and the impact that it has had on greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, when you have that very much tunnel vision that dominates the economy as well as dominates the political environment, you will then constantly feed into a developmental model that will pit the environment against economic growth and prosperity. So until you cannot divorce the two. So until you start to see an alternative to that development model, then trying to address the climate crisis will, I guess, facilitate the opportunity for obstruction to happen. So we talk about in some of the outside literature, for instance, we create new environments for, say, crime to take place. So we talk about how, in the case of carbon credit systems, so we've talked about fraud within carbon credit systems. You've created for an environment for a crime to take place. But that new environment is also based on climate change. This neoclassical approach, that will negatively impact the environment. So you're opening doors to try and address the climate crisis, but within an environment which is not going to do so. And I think that's an important point to show why actually approaches to development that dominate society, that will dominate UNFCCC negotiations, that dominate politics, will fundamentally stall the progress required and become obstacles in and of themselves.
Have you heard this phrase in Canada, decarbonized oil?
Yes, we've heard it in the US too. Occidental Petroleum claims to have shipped the first barrel of net zero oil, carbon negative oil.
Yes.
It's outrageous. Yeah.
It's beyond comprehension. Like the fraud and all sorts of things are now so deeply ingrained in thought processes of our policymakers that they can say something, decarbonized oil, and that's how you reach your net zero goal.
It blows my mind that people are like, but it makes sense on the spreadsheet, though. The atmosphere doesn't care about your spreadsheet. You know? Actually, I want to ask you guys about how these two things that we've been talking about kind of come together, because there's the really complex UNFCCC stuff happening, and then there's all of the market forces stuff. And I feel like it is creating this situation where a lot of global South countries are getting into the oil business now, and they're talking about using that money to pay for climate adaptation because there's such a failure on international climate negotiations to get money to deal with this problem that they're now dependent on oil companies and the money from them to pay for it.
You mentioned that in your note to us, citing particularly the case of Guyana, right?
Yes.
I have watched many speeches by Guyana's president, who talks very eloquently and captivates audience.
They were a really early mover on carbon credits too, actually.
Because they have intact forests and very rich biodiverse forest areas, so that they can use that. But in terms of the issue of extractive industry logics to address climate action, Guyana is such a fascinating case to see how they present their case. And it shows, as you rightly pointed out, the failure of UNFCCC system to mobilize financial support for these countries. Guyana, I guess, vast area of that country is below the sea level, and it will go underwater in coming few years, and it will require tons of resources and technical know-how to address those concerns. So who will pay for that? Yeah. They are, like, oil discovery is something that provided them with this opportunity. But I'm not quite sure whether, I'm very pessimistic in this regard. I'm not quite sure whether even if UNFCCC system mobilizes trillions for global South countries, it will persuade them to move away from extractive development pathway.
Yeah.
Because I have seen from your reporting also about Guyana that there is a deep connections between carbon majors and political elites within Guyana.
Yeah.
So, and this president, the current president, he acknowledged several times the contract between Guyana and the oil company is one-sided. And his administration cannot really do much to address this disparity in the contract.
Yeah.
Because the political elites and carbon majors are on the same page in terms of exploiting resources as well as exploiting a poor country in the global south.
Okay, I want to talk about how these geopolitical things show up with respect to then not just the approach to development, but the actual investments in development from the development banks. So I'll give another example from Guyana. There was this really interesting thing that happened in the course of them kind of building out their oil industry, where at a certain point, the Biden administration in the US said, that's it. The Inter-America's Development Bank, we're not going to fund fossil fuel infrastructure anymore. And so the vice president said, well, then they should stop funding fossil fuel infrastructure in their own country. And I was like, he's not wrong. He's got a point. But they just kind of went, okay, fine, and went and got the money from China instead. So it's a good example of, okay, so it shifts, but then it just kind of comes back around.
Yeah, I would say in terms of geopolitics, we will emphasize one particular point, not just the role of new development bank led by BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And recently they also added 10 more countries. So it's BRICS plus. We'll emphasize one peculiar thing in terms of this geopolitical shift, and that is the rise of a new development mechanism known as South cooperation. So, for example, historically, it is widely documented by scholars that global North countries, especially the US and European powers, they used two major international financial institutions, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, to actually control, first implement their preferred development and economic agendas in countries in the global south, as well as exerting control over them. So with the rise of BRICS and the financial mechanisms that they created with the new banking systems like the New Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, we see a new development mechanism is emerging. So if Inter-American Development Bank, as a result of the influence of the US administration, decides not to invest in fossil fuel-based development projects in Global South, they now have option to approach another funding mechanism. And that funding mechanism is quite different in terms of conditionalities attached to those development projects. So traditionally, World Bank and International Monetary Fund, they attach many draconian conditions to each and every of their loan agreements. And these new arrangements that we see now emerging, they do not approach development interventions in the same way, attaching conditions, predetermined conditions to loan programs. Rather, they consider national needs, economic needs of their member countries and how they characterize a particular development projects and financial needs. And it is the job of these new development mechanisms, New Development Bank or Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to finance those projects that will lead to economic growth, prosperity, etc. And again, here comes the influence of these, as Ruth mentioned earlier, these tunnel vision of market-driven development and climate action projects. So we see these South-South cooperation along with these newly created new development banks are really shaping the trajectory in the global South. There are some critiques that it may lead to greenhouse gas emissions, and we see from evidence, although we cannot quite clearly establish the correlation between the existence of the creation of these new development banks and the rising greenhouse gas emissions in the global South countries. But certainly there are forceful critique of these South-South mechanisms that are sort of not paying serious attention to climate concerns arising out of their actions. For example, I can mention here one example very briefly. Bangladesh in South Asia is now developing several huge coal power plants. Historically, World Bank and Asian Development Bank, these two financial institutions were the major provider of financial support for major infrastructure development projects in Bangladesh and elsewhere. Since World Bank particularly decided some years ago not to finance in fossil fuel-based development projects, particularly in several countries, Bangladesh is one of them, then Bangladesh found another way to secure financial support, and they leveraged South-South cooperation mechanism, brought China, India to support their fossil fuel-based infrastructure development projects. So even though civil society groups, environmentalists, they vehemently opposed some of those projects, particularly one which is located near a UNESCO heritage site, a fragile mangrove forest, they failed to persuade both Bangladeshi government as well as their southern partners, China, India, to relocate or even cancel the project. So South-South mechanism, new development banks, new financing mechanisms is certainly shaking up the climate actions and policies in the global South.
Okay, let's talk about how multinational corporations fall into this. They're so helpful. How do they show up in this complicated mix of things? How we touched on this a little bit, that they often have a relationship with political elites in global South countries, but again, with the caveat that this term incorporates a whole lot of different countries. Yeah, how are multinational corporations getting involved here?
It's another complex story to tell, and it does dive into some of the things that we've covered previously. But I think a good way to do it is illustrate it. So when we discuss some of this in the chapter, we look at the Brazilian agribusiness sector context. And it's important to realize that it's not just oil and gas corporations. I think fundamentally there's a different, and what we've talked about, what we know already about climate obstruction previously, and what we hear a lot about in the news, the focus on oil and gas, ExxonMobil, Shell, all of those oil and gas actors, which have had a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But other sectors like the agribusiness sector are growing and increasingly high polluting industries. It's just they'll be concentrated in different locations. And one of those is basically in Brazil, the agri sector is now one of the biggest, I guess, exports that come from the country. And one of the key things that we have to think about in the context of Brazil is the deep interrelation between the agribusiness sector and their influence on the political system, and particular what we call the ruralista caucus that has and is able to exert a significant level of influence over Brazilian politics. And when you had Bolsonaro in power, and we could speak to Bolsonaro and his a certain alignment with, say, the now President of the United States, but at the time, alignment and that shift towards the far right. But beyond even Bolsonaro's reign in Brazil, the Ruralista caucus has a significant and has always had a significant presence within the National Congress. And I think as a result, those ties with corporate actors to the political system in that country in particular has allowed, I guess, a natural alignment between the political priority that comes from generating and expanding growth in Brazil. It's that national priority, improve the welfare of the population, all of that, even though we know that doesn't necessarily repeat and fall down and trickle down into improving the lives of millions of people. But nonetheless, that those two priorities, the government priorities and corporate priorities, fundamentally are aligned. And it is those multinational corporations that dot around different states that have power and control within these different, they've got the political alliances, I guess, that they're then able to shape national level agendas for economic growth, which often relates to these carbon intensive industries and high profit making industries as well. And so these multinationals, they have that lobbying capacity, I guess, to really connect their ideas, their interests with political interests, and thus what is seemingly the public interest. And it's important to recognize that the public have their own opinions, can have their own ideas around climate action, can resist it, but the overarching impact is spoken through the media as well. And it's the narratives, the constant narratives that you will see, including those in right-wing literature in Brazil, that feed in and continue this, let's grow the economy, let's push this sector, let's not worry too much about climate change just yet because we need to improve the conditions and lives of the public here and there. So I think it's that, I guess, political power that they're able to harness, but also their role in managing the media as well. And we've seen that with the history of ExxonMobil and the infiltration of, say, oil and gas as something natural to society. It's so normalized within, but behind naturalizing and normalizing oil and gas, it's normalizing the political economy, continuing the neoclassical model of economics to continue that. And so I think that's one big way in which multinationals are able to capture states, but also how states can align with multinational interests. So I think it's a two-way but very complex relationship that allows these large sectors to continue do what they're doing without the repercussions afterwards. And it even plays out in sort of legislation, say, for instance, and changing land uses, for instance, between sort of 1990 and 2018 in Brazil, there was like this change in policy around land uses. So it's AFOLU, so it's the agricultural, forestry, and other land uses. So that's how we refer to one way in which emissions are, and the way emissions are come from the agricultural, forestry, and other land uses industry. But that also ties with the land grabbing that would then be exerted in terms of environmental protection. So essentially, especially during the Bolsonaro administration, environmental protection essentially decreased. So legislation was churned and it was adjusted to boost, for instance, agricultural production, so that in the agribusiness sector was able to have an influence over those policies. So they're able to essentially target the political system and influence policy development so that it becomes open to opportunities to continue extracting resources, in this case, making sure there's room for agricultural development. But that impact on, say, land use in Brazil is the same type of impact on environmental protection policies that the fossil fuel industry is able to exert, say, in the US. So I think there's a similar picture that appears that we've seen in the global south, that we've seen in the global north, that then also appears in the global south, that is facilitated by these multinational corporations. So while there are distinctions to how multinational corporations and states interact in the global south and its impact in climate obstruction, there are some commonalities and I guess common modus operandi that exist, and particularly around changing and adapting policy for their interests. So there's evidence, I guess, that there's a consistent pattern of multinational corporations working with states, vested interests to exploit under the guise, I guess, of development, continuing this neoclassic economic growth model, and thus all the consequences of that come from environmental destruction, marginalization, moving people out of their communities, such as in the case of the indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest. So I think it's a common, you'll see common examples from multinational corporations and states in the global south and how they operate to obstruct climate action that we've seen in the global north, like the US, although it's not necessarily one which is of what you might be used to of open denial and just the purposeful dismantling of environmental protections that are more ideological, anti-science based that we've seen maybe in some of the global north countries. So the same pattern emerges is what I'm trying to say.
I don't know. I feel like every time I'm looking at this, I just come to the conclusion that it's maybe slightly better hidden in some global north countries, and that's about it. They've slapped a coat of paint on it. But I just want to ask you guys this last question, if you have a minute, about what can be done to fight climate obstruction in the global south, and what has worked, and what does that fight kind of look like?
I think maybe one of the things I want to start off with is actually to begin with the risks that people face. So I think it's fundamentally we have to be aware that a fight can take place and we can push forward for change. But I think actually navigating, say, if you're an academic or you're an environmental group, working on local level mobilization, that's one of the key ways in which groups have already started to do this. But we have to think about the risks that people are facing. So we've heard about things like environmental defenders who have been targeted as they try to challenge, say, deforestation across the Amazon. And when you've got such a lock-in between the extractive industries, state interests, political interests, corporate interests, it presents a risk that I think has to then be thought of very carefully in terms of what actions can be taken. So we know that we've got engagement from NGOs within UNFCCC negotiations. But when you've got countries where NGOs are going in, so countries from the Global South with their NGO representatives, there are a fewer number who are able to access those platforms to engage in the negotiations process. So at an international level and capacity-wise, being able to influence those higher level decisions becomes harder and harder and harder. And I think that also speaks to the problems of these big multilateral agreements that don't and are not really, they are doing something, but still don't seem to take the bold steps. And so I think it's really important that we turn to local level, but also be vitally aware of the complexities of within countries, what's going on, how political conditions are perceived, what you can take, for instance, even in the global West, the global North, the approach to environmental protesters and terrorism charges stacked on to, and I'm not so environmental groups. So that local level mobilization, that has to come from the people, but it's also to be fundamentally aware that this political and social context needs to be navigated very carefully, as there is this particularly a global shift to the political right as well, which we can see is being exerted across the world. So I wanted to get that hard conversation out there. Omar, do you have anything?
I'll just add one particular issue to the local dimensions of environmental climate mobilization. I'd also suggest that legal mechanisms, legal avenues, legal fight is something.
This ICJ thing is interesting. That just happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the new thing that happened just 2 days ago. So the local court mobilization is something that I see a fruitful way to really put pressure on political elites. In our writing, in our chapter, we mentioned one case of Sri Lanka, which in both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, vibrant environmental mobilization contested fossil fuel energy infrastructure projects. Sri Lankan mobilization succeeded. Bangladeshi case failed because in the case of Sri Lanka, environmental advocates, they engage their core system. And that actually forced the Sri Lankan government to cancel the project and negotiate a renewable energy projects with Indian financiers. So local mobilization, again, I will emphasize one particular thing, that is being aware of local political context, particularly with this growing trend of criminalizing energy and climate politics in the home of liberal democratic principles in the global north. We are now seeing activists are given jail sentences 3, 4, 5, 6 years for just participating in protests. So being aware of local political, economic, and legal context, but I'm pessimistic about transnational global thing. I'm more interested in locally rooted activism, but again, being aware of political maneuvering that is happening within their context. That is something that gives us hope, at least from different cases around the world that we see.